them and says, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter steps up and says, "You're the Messiah." And Jesus gives him that shush that makes you know that he's got it right. But we also remember, because for the sake of redundancy and for the sake of making sure we get that big moment, we've also noticed that in the very next scene, Peter gets called Satan for refusing to fathom that a Messiah could be destined to die, right? Step one, you're the Messiah. Ding, 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 ding. Step two, and you're not going to die. Right? He gets the second one wrong, right? So the question is, does Mark give us any clues that Peter and the guys are ever going to get this right? After 16:8, it seems like they're never going to. And if I haven't lived in Mark's community and known that we celebrate the resurrection every Sunday and heard the stories of Peter, if all that had never happened, I would say, bummer of a finish, right? The story is a tragedy. This guy lives this enormous life and helps this person and that and has powers like God, and then he rises from the dead and nobody ever learns about it. If I hadn't been in Christian history along the way, if I hadn't been among followers of Jesus 2 generations out, I would go away scared myself and disappointed, right? But Mark has left breadcrumbs right in the middle of the gospel. I want you to turn to that part in chapter 8 of the gospel, just before Peter's declaration and all that goes on at Caesarea Philippi. So we'll go to 8, middle of the chapter. 22. This comes immediately after the second feeding in chapter 8. And it comes immediately before that big moment at Caesarea Philippi. And it is frankly weird. Anybody think of Jesus as someone who has power outages? Right? From reading this gospel, we would come away saying, if Jesus wants somebody healed, they'll be healed. If Jesus wants a storm to be calmed, it'll be calmed. If he wants to walk on water, take off, right? Jesus, at every point in this gospel, is powerful as he wants to be. Right? And then, suddenly, in this healing of a blind man at Bethsaida, 22 through 26, something looks weird. They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch the guy. So he took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And when he had put saliva on his eyes, on the guy's eyes, and laid his hands on him, he asked him, "Can you see anything?" Now, what would we expect as the answer? Shazam, I sure can. And then running and leaping and praising God as Acts 3 will have it, right? But that's not the answer he gives. And the man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees walking." Some of you have had this experience when you aren't wearing your spectacles, right? They look like trees walking. You get this vague sense, but they aren't even human. They're too vague. I can't see, even though I can see a little bit. And then Jesus laid hands on him again. And he looked intently, and his sight was restored. And he saw everything clearly. Then Jesus sent him away to his home, saying, "Don't even go into the village." Right? Another shushy moment. But I want to think about this for a second, because it is entirely possible that this is one of the miracle stories that ended up on Mark's desk, and that he's just throwing it in there because, you throw in the kitchen sink when you're writing a gospel. But we've found he's a little more subtle and a little more intentional than that, right? So we want to go to what could be the symbolic significance of this miracle. Why does, surely we know from the other gospels, Surely there are other great and powerful miracle stories that don't have to be done twice, right? Surely there's one on the stack that has Jesus saying, be healed, and the person is altogether healed again. And Mark has a bunch like that. So why in the world pull this one off the stack? Well, we're going to see in the story of Peter, Peter seeing, kind of, right? Jesus asks, who do people say that I am? Then he asks, who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you're the Messiah. I get it. And Jesus says, shh, which means yes. And then Jesus starts to tell him he's going to go to the cross, and they'll go to Jerusalem, he'll be mistreated, and then he'll end up dying on the cross. And Peter retorts and says, never, 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 and gets him called Satan in the mix. Gets himself called Satan in the mix. He sees, but he doesn't see. Right? And so the disciples, represented by Peter, end up the people who, after one stage of this healing, kind of get it. But at the end of 16:8, still haven't gotten the second part, right? They fled the cross. They forsook him and fled, to use Mark's language, and hid in caves and crevices so that nobody would know that they'd been with Jesus. Peter even folded in front of the slave girl at the fire outside the chief priest's house. They have not dignified themselves. They have failed him utterly. So if they saw partly, they're still at best seeing partly. When the story ends, even the women who had stayed on through the cross came out not to celebrate resurrection, but to anoint his body, right? Nobody gets it at the end in 16:8. Nobody gets it at all. And then somebody in the room, and I put this way in your handout, but I don't know how many of you got a chance to read it before we gathered. Then somebody in the room, because you can imagine, after 16:8, there must have been just a long silence in that ancient market living room, right? This sort of, wait a second, they ran away scared. Wait, can you read that again? Can you read that again? And then everybody just sitting silently, as you do when you're both mystified and petrified, right?